Hey, it's Shannon Ballard. Southern Mysteries is an independent podcast made possible by the support of patrons who help me continue to share stories like the one you'll hear today. I appreciate all of my patrons, including our newest members, Alexandra Algier from Louisville, Kentucky, Aaron Langham from Arley, Alabama, Andrea Schofield from Cottonwood Heights, Utah, and to those listening and supporting from mysterious locations, MJ Rodriguez, Ruth Cottrell, Mitchell, KT Dards, and Caitlin Edwards. I appreciate your support. Now, if you're new to Southern Mysteries and you're curious about joining in and supporting this independent podcast, you should know that on Patreon, you can hear ad-free episodes and the show archive of the first 3 seasons, which isn't available anywhere else. I'll tell you this, it sounds much different than the episodes you hear these days, but there's some great stories in the first 3 seasons. You can also join at a level where you have access to a lot of bonus content, like the archives of patron-exclusive podcasts through the years and my patron-exclusive monthly podcast, Audacious. Check it out, see if it's right for you. There are 2 options for joining in on Patreon, and it's easy to opt in and out. See for yourself and start listening to episodes you haven't heard before at patreon.com/Southern Mysteries. In October 2004, NBC News reported Google had been able to do something law enforcement officials and their resources could not. Google was used to identify the victim of a hit-and-run accident in 1993. A detective in Washington State searched Google for about a week and suddenly found a match. The victim of a hit-and-run in Yakima, Washington on February 1st, 1993 was 39-year-old David Glenn Lewis, who went missing from Amarillo, Texas, on or around January 31st. The resolution of one mystery deepened another. Who drove the car involved in the hit-and-run? And why was David Lewis 1,600 miles from home in Washington State, an area where he had no known connections? The circumstances of his disappearance, reported sightings in the days leading up to and following his disappearance from Texas, made the case all the more perplexing for David's family and law enforcement. Welcome to Southern Mysteries, exploring Southern history and true crime. I'm your host, Shannon Ballard. This is the story of the mysterious disappearance and death of David Glenn Lewis. David Glenn Lewis was looking forward to watching Super Bowl 27. The Dallas Cowboys were taking on the Buffalo Bills the last weekend in January in 1993, and Lewis was hoping he'd get to see his Cowboys win the big game. David's wife and daughter planned a weekend away in Dallas, while David planned to catch up on work so he would be free to watch the game. For reasons we may never know, David's plans changed. It seems he did not watch the Cowboys defeat the Bills. Somehow, this beloved nice guy from Texas became a John Doe killed by a hit-and-run driver on a rural road in Washington State. Around 10:30 p.m. on February 1st, 1993, a motorist driving State Route 24 in Moxie, Washington, just outside of Yakima, saw a man walking near the intersection with Rivard Road. The driver noticed the man appeared disoriented as they slowly drove by and turned around to try to see if he needed help. By the time the driver found an area to turn around, they had passed a Chevrolet Camaro as they made their way back to the area where they had seen the disoriented man. When they arrived at that stretch in the road, the man was lying in the road, apparently the victim of a hit-and-run. The driver notified authorities, and the man, who had no identification, was pronounced dead at the scene. Tests later showed John Doe was not intoxicated and had no drugs in his system. For years, investigators tried to identify John Doe. In 2003, Washington State Patrol Detective Pat Ditter read an investigative series about missing person cases and problems that have been detected with missing person databanks used by law enforcement. there had been unreliable computer hits from the NCIC, the National Crime Information Center. In 2003, Google wasn't a verb. The immediate response for civilians or law enforcement wasn't Google it to try to find additional information. But Pat Ditter decided he would try that. For 1 week, he Googled details about John Doe, which led him to a missing person site. When he saw a picture of a man named David Lewis on the Texas Department of Public Safety Missing Persons website, he immediately noticed the resemblance to the face of John Doe, apart from the glasses. In the Texas missing person photo, David Lewis was wearing distinctive black glasses, which he always joked he needed to see anything. John Doe wasn't wearing glasses when he was found. Ditter decided to check the evidence list from the crime scene, which listed the clothing the victim wore: camouflage, military-style clothes, and work boots, and inside the victim's pants, eyeglasses that look like the glasses David Lewis wore. Detective Ditter contacted the Amarillo Police Department and learned the department believed Lewis had gone missing on his own accord, and the case had been dropped by 2002. Texas police cooperated with Washington authorities, and following DNA analysis from the John Doe and a tissue sample David's family provided in 1993, they had a match. John Doe was David Lewis. The match meant the police still had two mysteries. How and why did David Lewis disappear from Amarillo, Texas, around January 31st, 1993, and wind up dead 1 day later along a road in rural Washington state? And who drove the car that killed him? Those are just two of many questions surrounding this baffling mystery. David Lewis was born in Borger, a small town in the Texas Panhandle, on December 11, 1953. He attended Phillips High School, where the star quarterback of his high school football team was known as the nicest guy on campus. David graduated from Texas Tech University with a political science degree in 1975, and 4 years later graduated from Texas Tech School of Law. In 1982, David married schoolteacher Karen Garrett. 1 year later, they welcomed their daughter, Lauren. The family lived in a quiet neighborhood just north of Amarillo. David was a well-known and respected leader in the Amarillo area. Friends and colleagues described him as a kind man who was always looking for ways to help others. This included volunteer work with several charitable organizations, from literacy groups and the Boy Scouts Council to the United Way and his church, where he taught Sunday school every week. David worked hard to advance his legal career. By 1986, he was elected judge of the Moore County Court at Law. In this role, he handled juvenile cases, and he took the role seriously. He felt he could help kids who made mistakes turn their life around and have a positive future. In 1990, David made a bid for a judgeship in the 69th District Court, but lost the election. He returned to his job at Buckner, Lara, and Swindle. He also began to teach evening government classes at Amarillo College. David Lewis seemed to have it all: a great family, a successful legal career, and the respect of his colleagues and the community at large, which is why his disappearance shocked his community. The Fort Worth Telegram-Star put together a timeline of David's activities leading up to the 39-year-old's disappearance in January 1993. On Thursday, January 28th, David's wife Karen and their 9-year-old daughter Lauren left town on their planned trip to Dallas to do some shopping and have a girls' weekend. They did not see or speak to David that day, as he had already left for work when they woke up. David went into work at his law practice, but left around noon, telling coworkers he wasn't feeling well and needed to go home to rest. None of his neighbors saw his red Ford Explorer parked in the driveway that day, and it's believed he never went home after he left work. That afternoon, he was seen at a gas station, and his credit card statement showed he purchased gas for his red Ford Explorer. That evening, he taught his government class at Amarillo College, which ended at the usual time, 10 p.m. apart from the sighting at the gas station, police were never able to determine what David was doing in that long stretch of time between noon and the time his college class began that evening. On Friday, January 29th, a close church friend saw David Lewis hurrying through the Southwest Airlines terminal in the Amarillo airport. She noticed he wasn't carrying any luggage. Around 10:30 that night, a police officer making his rounds at the Potter County Court building in Amarillo saw a red Ford Explorer parked in the lot. Police questioned why David would take a flight from the Amarillo airport that morning but not park his car at the airport. None of David's friends or family had given him a ride to the airport. On Saturday, January 30th, someone deposited $5,000 in David and Karen Lewis's joint bank account. Well, Karen told police it wasn't her, so authorities assumed it was David Lewis. That afternoon, a neighbor saw David's red Ford Explorer parked outside of the Lewis home. According to patrol records from the lot at the Potter County Court building, the Explorer, which had been parked in the lot the day before, was gone. On Super Bowl Sunday, January 31st, Karen and Lauren Lewis returned home from their Dallas trip. David wasn't home, but Karen noticed his wedding ring and watch on the kitchen counter. He always put them on when he left the house. Karen noticed their VCR system was recording the Super Bowl, but authorities could never verify if it was programmed to start to record when the game began or if someone manually pushed the record button. Karen found 2 freshly made turkey sandwiches in the refrigerator and laundry in the dryer. To Karen Lewis, the house looked normal, and she assumed David may have decided to work and watch the game later or had changed his plans, decided to watch the Super Bowl somewhere else with a friend. The same day, a sheriff's deputy making rounds at the Potter County Courts building noticed a man who looked like David Lewis standing across the street from the building. This man was taking photos of a red Ford Explorer parked out front. By the end of the day, David Lewis had not returned home, but this did not set off an alarm for Karen. Considering the Cowboys won, she assumed David may have been out late celebrating with friends, so she retired for the night. On Monday, February 1st, Karen became concerned when she received word that David had missed 2 work-related appointments. This was out of character for David Lewis. Karen called around, and when she couldn't locate David, called police to ask for help. Amarillo police responded, and as they began their search, they found David's red Ford Explorer parked in front of the courts building. His house and car keys were under the driver's side floor mat, and the items David normally kept in his car, his checkbook, credit cards, and driver's license, were also found inside. The vehicle was locked with David's keys inside. This was common for owners of Ford Explorers. It had a keyless entry keypad system. The system enabled the driver to enter a code on a keypad on the passenger side of the vehicle. By Tuesday, February 2nd, Amarillo police learned someone had bought 2 plane tickets in David Lewis's name. One was purchased on January 31st. It was a flight from Dallas to Amarillo. The other was for a flight from Los Angeles to Dallas and was purchased on February 1st. These flights seemed bizarre to authorities and Karen Lewis. Karen confirmed the family had no connections in Los Angeles, and she knew of no clients or work that would have taken David to LA. If he required a flight from LA to Dallas, how would he have gotten to Los Angeles? There was no record of a flight in his name to that city. In 1993, there was no requirement to show ID when purchasing an airline ticket, which meant police were unable to confirm whether the tickets had been used, and if so, if they had been used by David Lewis. The Dallas to Amarillo ticket was also of particular interest. There was no direct flight to Dallas from the Amarillo airport. Authorities theorized that when David's friend saw him at the Amarillo airport on Friday, January 29th, He may have flown to Dallas via a connecting flight. Authorities believe David Lewis went to Dallas. Something happened there, which led to the $5,000 deposit in the Lewis account on Saturday, January 30th. Police were also perplexed by a report on February 1st that a Dallas taxi driver picked up a very nervous and awkward man at a hotel. The man asked to be taken to the Dallas airport and paid his fare in cash. The driver remembered this man because when it was time for him to pay, he pulled out a wad of $100 bills and overpaid for the short trip. This man was never confirmed as David Lewis, but the taxi driver was adamant he had given a ride to the missing man from Amarillo. When Amarillo police met with Karen Lewis on the afternoon of February 2nd, she confirmed there was nothing suspicious missing from the Lewis home. Most of David's personal belongings were there, apart from his green sweatpants. They were gone, but Karen said if he had planned to go to the airport, there was no way he would have worn those sweatpants in public, knowing he would see people he knew at the very small Amarillo airport. Based on the timeline and information available to authorities, they had 3 theories as to how and why David disappeared. Foul play, such as kidnapping or murder, walking away from his life, or possibly ending his life. David's family insisted he would never leave voluntarily. He was too invested in his family and work to do that. Karen Lewis said she and David had a loving marriage. She insisted someone must have taken him or threatened him. Now, she did tell police that David had gotten several death threats during his time as a judge and had recently told her he was facing a dangerous situation, but he couldn't or wouldn't elaborate. At the time of his disappearance, David Lewis was preparing for a deposition in Dallas that was scheduled to happen the week after he went missing. He was to be deposed in a $3 million conflict of interest lawsuit brought against his former law firm. When asked about the case, David's lawyer, Thomas Kelly, said it was not cause for concern to him, telling police no one associated with the case would benefit from David's disappearance. Thomas Kelly said the last conversation he had with David was an upbeat one, and David was ready to be deposed and move on. Kelly said he reminded David during this conversation the case was pretty insignificant and covered by insurance, meaning there would be no personal liability for David. Amarillo Police Detective James Smith also looked into another case that could have stirred up enemies for David. There was a lawsuit brought by murder convict Bobby Templin against his former father-in-law, Norbert Schlegel. David Lewis represented Schlegel in the case that was eventually withdrawn by Templin. Schlegel told the press he believed someone abducted David and killed him, possibly pointing to Bobby Templin. But Detective Smith said Templin lacked the money or influence a suspect would need to arrange a murder from prison. Detective Smith confirmed he spoke with some of David's colleagues who painted a different picture of David's life than his wife had. Smith said David was known to be concerned about a decline in business at his practice, and he had openly spoken with colleagues about the disappointment he was still dealing with, having lost the election for judgeship in the 69th District Court. Detective Smith couldn't rule out the possibility that David may have wanted to end his life as he knew it, which could have meant literally ending his own life or willingly leaving his life in Amarillo behind. David's family believed foul play was the only option, but with no sign of a body and records of plane tickets purchased under his name, David Lewis was eventually declared as missing voluntarily. Police Detective Smith told the Fort Worth Times in June 1993 that he and his whole department were baffled by the case, and it haunted him. He would wake up at 2 a.m, asking himself, what happened to David Lewis? When David was officially listed as voluntarily missing, Detective Smith reminded the public the case had all the earmarks of someone walking away from their life and added, people don't always do what you expect them to do. Over a decade later, the Lewis family and Amarillo police finally got the answer as to what happened to David. He had been killed in a hit and run on a 2-lane highway near Moxie, Washington. But how did he get there? And why was David Lewis in Washington state? The site of the hit and run that killed David was 10 miles from the Yakima, Washington airport. The coroner ruled David died at 10:24 p.m. on February 1st, 1993. This is one day after the last sighting of David Lewis, but that final sighting is listed as unconfirmed. Now, if David was indeed seen in Amarillo on January 31st, this meant he traveled about 1,600 miles and died within 29 hours of the moment he was believed to have set his VCR to record the Super Bowl, if he was not in his home to manually hit record on that tape. When Karen Lewis was notified of the circumstances surrounding the death of her husband, she said his clothing sounded bizarre. When David's body was found, he was wearing a worn pair of camouflage military fatigues and work boots. Karen found this so odd because David did not own clothing like that. She had never known him to wear that kind of clothing. Karen also wanted to know how he got to Washington. His red Ford Explorer was in Texas. By car, the drive to the Yakima area from Amarillo would have taken at least 24 hours. By air, it would have taken several hours or more because there were no direct flights into the Yakima airport. But no record of a flight in David's name to the Yakima area could be found, and there were no records of David renting a car. David Lewis's family has always maintained that when he mentioned his concern that his life was in danger, there was a real threat. They believed he was kidnapped, but were still puzzled as to how he ended up a victim of a hit and run on that rural road in Washington. With no sign of a struggle at David's home, his office, or in his vehicle, there's been a lot of doubt cast on the kidnapping theory. There were only ever sightings of David Lewis on his own, which indicated he made the decision to leave Texas. Telling his wife he was in danger could indicate one of two things. First, there was a real danger. David left to protect himself and his wife and daughter from harm. Second, there was no real danger. David had a mental break of some kind. The strange airline ticket purchases, his very awkward behavior with that friend who spotted him at the airport, the taxi driver who reported a sighting of a man acting in a strange way, all of this indicated he may not have been himself at the time of his disappearance. David was under a lot of stress in the months leading up to his disappearance, and it's been suggested he could have been in a dissociative fugue state. It's a rare psychiatric phenomenon characterized by reversible amnesia for one's identity, combined with unexpected and unexplained wandering or travel. Some people establish a new identity because in this state of mind, they can lose memories of their life as they've known it and tend to disappear, suddenly leaving their family and job, often traveling to random places with no explanation or knowledge of who they are or why they've traveled. It is very rare, and some in the mental health community don't recognize dissociative fugue state as a diagnosis, but there are documented cases of disappearances that were later found to be the result of what many in the mental health community agreed was a fugue state brought on by overwhelming stress or trauma. Jody Roberts, a reporter for the Tacoma News-Tribune, disappeared in 1985. 12 years later, she was found living in Sitka, Alaska, using the name Jane D. Williams. Experts believe she experienced a protracted fugue state. In 2006, Jeff Ingram suddenly appeared in Denver, Colorado, but he didn't know who he was. He had no memory of his life or his name. He asked for help and was featured on a television program. His fiancée saw the show and called Denver police to identify him. The episode was diagnosed as dissociative fugue. This wasn't Jeff's first episode. It happened once before in 1994 and again in 2007. If either of these theories is true, it still does not answer the question of who killed David Lewis on that lonely road in Moxie. Ultimately, it seems he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it's likely the hit and run itself had nothing to do with his disappearance. The answer as to why David disappeared from Texas and the circumstances surrounding his death will likely never be answered. When John Doe died in Moxie in 1993, the town tried everything they could think of to try to identify him, bring closure to a family who must be missing this man. They had a local newspaper take a picture of his face at the morgue so it could be printed in an attempt to ID him. But as time passed, he needed to be buried. Even though no one knew him, a group of people attended a small funeral service for this stranger in a local cemetery. They printed a small obituary for John Doe in the local paper out of respect for the life that had been lost. When John Doe was finally identified as David Glenn Lewis, his remains were brought home to Texas for burial. His family shared these words in his obituary. "Your love and devotion have been missed so very much. You touched so many lives while you were here. How sad that many of your dreams were left unfulfilled." Southern Mysteries is created and hosted by me, Shannon Ballard. As always, you can find the sources for each episode in the full show notes at southernmysteries.com. If you enjoy Southern Mysteries, I encourage you to rate and review the show where you're listening to help spread the word, and make sure you hit the follow button in your player so you never miss a new episode. And Southern Mysteries exists because of the core support from patrons who love hearing these stories and want to hear more. If you want to learn more about this independent podcast and supporting the show via Patreon, where you can access episodes that are only available to patrons, just head to patreon.com/Southern Mysteries. As always, thanks for listening.